Jesus was the most meek and gentle of men. Matthew quotes Isaiah 42, saying of Jesus, "He will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench." Listen then to this gentle man. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Jesus wasn't always gentle in his words. But as I look at his verbal confrontations, I find them to be focused on one subject, hypocrisy. And in this focus, he stands solidly in the tradition of the prophets, including Isaiah. Now, fortunately, in 2,000 years, God's church, the community of his people, has never fallen into the hypocrisy that God hates. Not. Sadly, we have often given the world cause to call us hypocrites, and our enemy takes every advantage of that. So in our text, Isaiah 58, God challenges us to examine ourselves for religious hypocrisy, and he reminds us that true devotion is expressed in compassion to others. Now, I've mentioned the book Unchristian before. It resulted from a 3-year study of the convictions of unchurched people about the church. The details are fascinating, but to put it succinctly, 91% of unchurched people think the church is homophobic, 87% think the church is judgmental, and 85% think we're hypocrites. And we, the church, have probably given people some reasons to feel that way. Though other people in that huge percentage probably judge us based only on what they've been told and what they hear in the media, and the media can be so wrong. I read a long, fascinating article about Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, which gave extended examples of this school's staff meeting a particular person's homosexual orientation with compassion and truth and actual help. But I don't think many people, even Christians, would believe that. The Westboro Baptist churches of the world are seen as the norm to 91% of our population. And we have too often been guilty, especially of these other things of judgmentalism and hypocrisy. So we as a church need a chapter that begins by exposing the hypocritical devotion of God's people. Isaiah 58, 1 through 5. Cry aloud, do not hold back, lift up your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why have we fasted and you have seen it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard on high. Is such the fast I have chosen? A day for a person to humble himself? Is it to bow down his head like a reed and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Last week, Todd described some interesting elements of Isaiah, including the fact that the last 27 chapters are like the 27 books of the New Testament. Here, Isaiah is looking forward to the New Testament, to the redemption through the suffering servant, and to life as redeemed people. In other words, these last chapters of Isaiah look forward as much to our situation as they do to the circumstances of Isaiah's own nation. So Isaiah 55 last week was a clear call to our day to follow Jesus, even though his name wasn't mentioned in that chapter. And in the same way, the warnings of Isaiah 58 apply very directly to us, to God's church in our day. As one commentator says, God is moving toward the new heavens and the new earth. He has sent Christ, his servant, to bear human guilt, to justify the ungodly, qualifying them for this new world. He pours out his Spirit upon those he has redeemed. And what he wants now is his church to be the model home for the new neighborhood he has promised to build. What kind of church is persuasive in that role? What kind of church is preparing the way for the Lord? Isaiah tells us. And his message is challenging, not because it's all that hard to understand, but because it's just plain blunt. So this is a warning. God tells Isaiah, cry aloud, declare to my people their transgressions. And what do we expect to read next? What are these sinful people going to be accused of? And maybe it's surprising because Isaiah says, they seek me daily and delight to know my ways. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to me. If you, heaven forbid, had to move to a new town and you found a church that sought God daily, delighted to know his ways and to draw near to him, you'd probably join that church. But Isaiah might not. It's possible for a church to do all these good things while still having major issues in God's eyes. Isaiah hears them asking that question. Why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? I mean, isn't fasting, humbling ourselves, evidence that we take sin seriously? Why are things still desperate? Why isn't God responding? Because they think they can obligate God, pressure God. And when they're fasting and praying don't lead directly to God's blessing, they resent him. What poisoned their souls toward God was not sins like thievery and murder. It was their own false religion. You see the key there in verse 2. They are doing these things as if they were a nation that did righteousness. They were role-playing righteousness. So God is warning his people that religious show, hypocritical sham, is sin and leads to judgment. And this is where we have to begin to identify ourselves in this text. It's easy to make a list of what our subculture, evangelicalism, considers Christian and godly behavior. Go to church on Sunday, attend a home group, read your Bible and pray. Even fasting can be on this list. And on top of that, we add expectations like keep your kids under control, dress modestly, don't watch R-rated movies, certainly don't do porn or drugs, and a lot of these are good things, important things. But the things described in the passage are good things too, and God calls them a sham. So we have to ask ourselves if we're being hypocritical in pursuing those things while neglecting true heart change. In verse 3, God begins to expose their true hearts. In the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. The first phrase reveals the temptation we all face. We say we're seeking God, but we do only what we want and what brings us pleasure. Now, I'm not saying serving God shouldn't be joyful. He did make us to delight in him, but it's so tempting to cross the line and seek our own pleasure under the facade of devotion. I read this week about Vaughn Reeves, who's serving 54 years for investor fraud. At his trial, witnesses said his biblically based, church-based company, Alinar, was started with the best and most godly intentions of helping people. But as millions of dollars flowed through his fingers, Reeves began to take more and more for himself and his sons, ultimately siphoning $6 million into airplanes and homes while losing hundreds of millions of dollars invested by innocent and often retired church people. And I don't think even Reeves could tell you when his heart shifted from devotion to personal satisfaction, but it did. That's how our enemy works. And I think in many cases of sexual scandal in the church, the pastor or even the priest started out wanting to be compassionate or simply friendly. But then sexual pressure began to be a subtle focus until it burst forth into full-blown sin. You seek your pleasures. And the second phrase, you oppress your workers, is a bit further removed from many of us, though some of you here do control other people's schedules and their salaries. Some of you can hire or fire, and those responsibilities, like all of our responsibilities, must be done not in spite of devotion to God's ways, but in light of devotion to God's ways. We need to be sensitive to his ways in every area of life. That's what Jesus said to the Pharisees. You have neglected the weightier matters of the law. You have neglected justice and mercy and faithfulness. So shouldn't I be asking whether my devotion to God is leading me to desire justice for the wronged, to show compassion to the struggling, and to be faithful even in difficulties? That's what God desires. And Isaiah gets even more personal in verse 4. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and fight and to hit with a wicked fist. So here you are, praying and fasting, asking God for something, probably something really good, but at the same time, you are pursuing known grievous sin in your own life. In 2 weeks, we're going to start a series applying verses like these to family situation. And this one applies because for us, it's in families mostly that people pound their loved ones with Bible verses while pounding them verbally or physically. Again, don't get me wrong. I believe physical discipline is a legitimate tool in child training. Scripture is as well. But both must be applied in compassion, through tears. This fist, this violence, this quarreling and fighting comes from anger and from wounded pride and from selfishness and from fear. And it's one of the most damaging hypocrisies in God's church. God longs to get hold of you at the fundamental level of controlling your voice, controlling your words, controlling your anger, and especially controlling your physical behavior. Doesn't he? He does. In verse 5, Isaiah returns to the worthlessness of mere devotion. He describes a really good fast, a day for a person to humble himself, to bow his head, to spread sackcloth and ashes, and then he says, you think this is fasting? You think these behaviors that we do, these Christian and godly behaviors, are inherently pleasing to the Lord? No, not if there's a disconnect from your heart condition. And verses 6 and 7 show the true evidence of what your heart will be devoted to. Is not this the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? The Bible is clear. Your heart, your mouth, and your hands are deeply connected. Jesus wanted followers who would have heart religion, not external show. He was speaking directly to this when he said, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." The angry words and angry fists and self-seeking pleasures that Isaiah has been exposing are evidence of the true state of our hearts. But justice and compassion are evidence of our hearts as well. Thus, true fasting is to loose the bonds of wickedness and undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. There are all kinds of yokes, all kinds of bondage in the world. In recent months, we've mentioned human trafficking, and the statistics are shocking. Over 2.4 million victims, 80% sold into sexual slavery, the remainder into forced labor like the boys of Lake Volta. It's a $32 billion industry. And get this, the average cost of a human being, go buy one, $90. There are many kinds of oppression. The Old Testament, for example, speaks about excess interest as a form of bondage. So I looked up the statistics on Rent-A-Center, which I've always felt was exploitive. Do you know that the interest rate on a rent-to-own TV is 160% annually? You get a $500 TV for $1,406 over 2 years. And if you miss no payments, you own a worthless TV. This is exploitation, folks. So verse 6 calls us to involvement in all these kinds of things, to add practical compassion to the top of our list of spiritual disciplines. For example, some folks from Trinity are involved in Mosaic Road, which is a group of people gathering to sell crafts and art in order to support the fight against human trafficking. But there are thousands of other ways that God might call your heart to help. And this practical compassion is what he wants to see in our hearts. So verse 7 becomes even more practical. Share bread with the hungry. Bring the homeless into your home. Clothe the naked, and do not turn away from those in need. You can live this out. On the simple end, those blessing bags that I showed the kids this morning can bless people. I know some will resent it, but given in love with prayer, simple things like that can make a difference. At the radical end of things are things like bringing a needy child into your home through adoption, which many here have done. Taken to another level, Tom and Amy Morrow moved to Africa to care for the neediest group of people in the world, poverty-stricken orphans whose parents have died of AIDS. And somewhere in the middle, for all of us, are things like Family Promise, which provides meaningful help to the homeless in our area, and which is effective because it is the work of many hands. But we have to avoid the problem of letting this become merely mechanical. The idea is to be pouring yourself out for the hungry, the hurting, and the oppressed. If your heart isn't in it, it just becomes another mechanical devotion. And God won't be any happier with it than he would with mechanical fasting or mechanical praying. But the beauty of practical compassion, at least, is that unlike fasting or praying or any of our individual disciplines, this fulfills both halves of the Great Commandment. This is loving God by loving others. True devotion to God expresses itself in compassion toward others. And God promises sweet blessings from this. The last 5 verses here mix more warning, more description of what God really wants, and a lot of blessing. Verses 8 to 12. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in scorched places and make your bones strong, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. Verse 8 is the first clear word of blessing in the whole passage. Your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. When God's people reach out with justice and compassion to the poor and the needy and the oppressed and to the hurting within their midst, it's like turning on a light. It's like rising up in health. We were made to be this. We were made to be the light of the world. We were redeemed so that we could offer people the bread of life and the living water, so that we could offer people Jesus in sincerity and in integrity of life. And it's when we do this that light and healing flow through us, and flowing through us, they bless us as well as others. We are blessed here with the very presence of God. Then your righteousness shall go out before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer, and you shall cry, and he will say, here I am. God promises his presence. Those who are extending compassion and opposing oppression will experience his I am here in their own lives. I've experienced it this week. God is never far from us when we are trying to do his work with the right heart attitude. Now, the rest of this verse begins the second quick cycle. Hypocrisy, alternative to hypocrisy, blessing. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, this is the hypocrisy. We must not lay burdens and yokes on others we know we cannot keep ourselves. The recent history of the church is sadly full of key evangelical leaders who have publicly spoken on morality, especially sexual morality, and then been caught in disgusting moral failures. It makes me mad, and at the same time it makes me deeply cautious, because while I'm not a key leader, I have spoken truth about sexual things, and I do not want to bring disgrace on the name of the Lord by hypocrisy. Notice that the verse also condemns the pointing of fingers. God is not pleased when we point to accuse or point to gossip, speaking wickedness about others, judging. Now again, don't get me wrong, God's people need to identify and address evil and sin among us. But that does not excuse judgmentalism, distancing ourselves from others, belittling others because of their perceived personal faults. We are judgmental when we distance ourselves from someone without any heart knowledge of that person. We are judgmental when hidden fear of our own moral weakness or even fear of our kids' moral weakness causes us to put up barriers to other believers who don't seem like us. We are judgmental when we speak to others about a third person's sin. The Pharisees were judgmental about everything, from what the disciples ate to who Jesus ate with. And Jesus did launch his strongest words right at them. So the study I mentioned earlier showed that the church is seen as homophobic, hypocritical, and judgmental. And no matter how local or isolated these things are compared to what the media teaches, we have no business being the ones who offer our enemy real homophobia or real hypocrisy or real judgmentalism, because he will take advantage of that. Instead, God says again in verse 10, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted. Then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. So are you pouring yourself out for the hungry? For the hungry on the street corner? For the hungry around the world? Amazing statistics. Every year, 9 million people die of hunger-related causes. That's the entire population of Houston, plus San Antonio, plus Dallas, plus Austin, plus Fort Worth, plus 8 other Texas cities. Imagine that devastation. All the people you know dead in the coming year. And what about the spiritually hungry? Those who need to hear the good news of a Savior who is both bread and water of life. Are you pouring yourself out for them in any practical way to bring this good news to their deep spiritual hunger? God blesses those who do. Verse 11, and the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. This is just God blessing us. But notice a couple things. Notice he's blessing you in a scorched place. He is guiding you because you're in a place where you need guidance. This is blessing for real life in the midst of our journeys and trials. He says your bones will be strong. You'll be able to do this. And don't miss that he tells you you will be a source of blessing to others. You'll be a watered garden. That is, you'll provide food for others. And you will be a spring of unfailing water to those around you. Very cool. I read about a study this week on what makes people live long and or happy lives. The author seems surprised that what makes for happiness also makes for long life. But the key conclusion was the importance of relationships. Notice this, secular study. Connecting with and helping others is more important to longevity than even a rigorous exercise program. And it wasn't getting help from others that conferred long life. It was giving help to others. Do you ever notice that science sometimes gets hints about what the Bible has been teaching for years? That helping other people is a blessing. Finally, verse 12. And your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. I love that verse. Do you want to do something for your world, your nation, your church, your family? Show practical compassion to the poor, the needy, the oppressed, the widows, the orphans, the hungry, the sick. God says you will raise the foundations of many generations. This is a family blessing. If you take hold of true devotion to God, expressed in care for others, forsaking violence, anger, oppression, and mistreatment, you will raise up a generational family, blessing not just your children, but your grandchildren and beyond. There's a study, famous among preachers, that compared the Max Jukes family and the Jonathan Edwards family. Both men lived about the same time and had numerous descendants. But many of the descendants of Max Jukes, a hard-drinking and probably irreligious man, were criminals and vagrants and prostitutes and on the state dole. Jonathan Edwards, on the other hand, was one of the most godly and intelligent men America has ever produced. And almost none of his descendants were criminals, or even everyday farmers or workers. They were pastors, lawyers, judges, college professors, college presidents, physicians, public officials, governors, congressmen, senators, officers in the army, authors, and editors. Jonathan Edwards raised up the foundation of many generations. And people who behave this way, and remember, this way is showing compassion to the poor, the oppressed, the hungry, and the homeless. People who behave this way will find that loving on others is a huge blessing. It's good for you. And you will be both blessed and honored for it. God says, these are the people who repair the breaches in the walls and restore the streets of his spiritual kingdom. So what have we said? Fear hypocrisy. Fear it. And let practical compassion be a spiritual discipline for you. Now, hypocrisy is a notoriously difficult thing to self-identify and root out. If you become too hard on yourself, you're immobilized. If you become too soft on yourself, you continue to harm others. So you need to pray for a realistic assessment of whether through violence, anger, judgmentalism, or hidden sin, you are unblessing your world, your nation, your church, your family. Such self-examination is hard and necessary work. But let me leave you with something a little bit easier. Add practical compassion to your list of spiritual disciplines. Find a way to fight injustice even while searching your heart for injustice toward others. Find a way to feed the hungry even while being sensitive to the spiritual hunger all around you. Find a way to help the hurting while not neglecting the spiritual hurts of those closest to you. Pour yourself out for the needs of others, and God promises that he will pour himself in to you and then out through you. Let's pray. Lord God, this passage is testing. It tries my soul. Lord God, I do not want to be the hypocrite portrayed in these verses. I don't want to be the one putting on a show up here on Sunday and then harming people. Lord God, I ask for your compassion on me and your mercy, which you do pour out so freely. And I ask, Lord, for eyes to see my own sin and to understand what you desire of me. And Lord, I ask that you'd help me to be practical in my compassion, to help others in ways that are helpful, and Lord, to deeply desire to make a difference not only spiritually, but maybe especially physically in the lives of those who are hungry and hurting and oppressed. Lord God, be glorified in this. I ask it in your name. Amen.